If you're a long-time viewer of my channel, you'll already be aware that I enjoy taking inspiration from the Total War Warhammer series of games. And with the release of the new Thrones of Decay DLC, Creative Assembly have tasked me with recreating one of the new units in miniature form. There were lots of excellent candidates too. We have Elspeth von Draken and her Nuln arsenal of landships, engineers and riflemen, Malachi Mackison, the Dwarf Slayer and engineer who brings along the infamous Goblin Hewer, fanatical Doomseekers, and the impressive Thunderbarge. But I've always had a soft spot for Nurgle, and so I was drawn to Tamarkan, in much the same way that flies are. And so in this video, I'll be showing you how to kitbash and paint a Nurgle Toad Dragon. There did in fact used to be a Tamarkan miniature. It was a huge and pretty expensive Forge World miniature. For this build, I decided to scale things back in terms of both scale and cost, and base my build around the Seraphon Carnosaur. But to recreate that gaping maw of the Toad Dragon, I would need to combine it with the jaw of a Tyranid Morlock. To add this new, much larger lower jaw to the Carnosaur head, I first needed to remove the existing jaw using my saw. After sawing through both sides, the cut was then cleaned up with my knife. Another iconic part of the Toad Dragon was the rhino-like horn that protruded from the tip of its nose. I recreated this using one of the large horns found within the Carnosaur kit, but first created a flat surface on the nose in which to mount the horn. The base of the horn was also removed, and to give it more of a rotten appearance, I then clipped away the tip. To further this broken effect, my pin vise was used to drill a hole into the horn in order to create a cavity inside. After drilling down a few millimeters, I finished off the damaged horn by cutting a few cracks around the outside of the hole. With the horn built, the head could be assembled, the horn glued, and the plate added on top. My next task was to attach the Morlock jaw to it. After assembling the jaw, I compared it against the head, which gave me a rough idea of how and where I should make my cuts. Steadily, I clipped and shaved both the Carnosaur head and the Morlock jaw, making frequent comparisons as I did so. Once things were lining up properly, I then glued the jaw to the head, along with the Morlock's tongue. While the Morlock jaw had a bunch of teeth around the sides, it was missing that front row of teeth that the Toad Dragon features. I needed to rebuild it. Unfortunately, I had the technology. Using some more spikes from the Carnosaur kit, I created a series of variously sized teeth, with a few of these also having that same broken effect that I employed on the horn. These were then glued to the front of the jaw in a fairly haphazard way to create a front row of teeth. From here, I continued to assemble the rest of the Carnosaur kit as per the instructions. One minor change that I did make was to adjust the inner claw from each foot. Normally these are held up and away from the other claws, making them reminiscent of a Velociraptor. The original Toad Dragon didn't feature these, so after a little snipping and trimming, they were glued in line with the rest of the claws. With the bulk of the model assembled, my next step was to begin the long process of sculpting. This began by mixing up some green stuff and rolling it out into a sausage shape that was laid across the inside of the teeth. Using a combination of my silicone and metal shaping tools, I pressed the green stuff down in and around the teeth to create the appearance of a gum. The side adjacent to the mouth was also blended into the surrounding area, and a few bumps and cuts were added to give them a more ragged appearance. As with the rest of the green stuffing, I also made use of a little Vaseline here. This just counteracts that stickiness and will help you to get a smoother overall finish. Continuing with the green stuff, I added small strips around the sides of the mouth to help fill in some of the gaps between the two parts. Once these were in place, I added a series of folds and creases before blending them into the surrounding areas. Next, I repeated the same steps that I'd used to create the gum, but on the other side of the teeth, completing the mouth for the time being. As I still had some green stuff mixed up, my next steps were to begin bulking out the underside of the Carnosaur to create the weightier look of the Toad Dragon. A few lumps were added around the neck to give the appearance of a hanging, bulbous flesh. This process was continued using some Milliput. If you've seen some of my past builds, you'll already be aware of my preference to use Milliput for sketching out the rough shapes of a model before using green stuff to add the details, and this build was no exception. I broke down the Milliput into fat sausages and steadily built them up, starting from the base of the tail, going all the way up to the mouth. Personally, I find Milliput well suited for this role, as it acts more like a clay and can be smoothed with water. This process was continued until I built up a bulkier profile for the Toad Dragon. Once complete, I allowed the Milliput to cure overnight. The Milliput had created a basic shape that could be built upon with some green stuff. Once again, more sausages were formed and laid across the Milliput, following the existing contours and shapes. After spreading out the green stuff to coat the surface, a series of creases and folds were pressed into the surface to help mimic a skin texture. Like with the underlying Milliput, this was built up towards the mouth until I was left with a much bulkier looking Toad Dragon where it was left to cure overnight. Next, it was time to finish off the green stuff work over the Toad Dragon with a few final details. Over the years of working with green stuff, I found that layering up the details can help massively. Breaking up your stages and giving your previous layers a chance to harden before proceeding helps to avoid accidentally squashing them. And this step was no exception. First, a final sausage was rolled out and laid across the edge of the mouth to form a lip. It's important to keep it distinct from the gums here. I then carefully pressed a series of vertical lines to form segments which ran perpendicular to the folds in the skin, preventing them from blending in too much. This was followed by lots of scales. I formed these by taking a small ball of green stuff, placing it onto the skin, and then gently pressing it flat. This causes an irregularly shaped disc that, when repeated several times across the surfaces, mimics the effects of scales. I bunched these up mainly around the transition from the plastic scales to the green stuff skin and steadily peated them out as they moved downwards. This not only helped with that blend, but also added a little extra detail to the green stuff. While this whole model is a little too small to accurately represent Tamacon and his particular Toad Dragon mount, Bubobolus, I would still use him as an inspiration for my own rider. I began with a Puscoil rider. This already came mounted, so their seated position made things much easier. To start off, I decided to add some extra armour in the form of an ogre gut plate. This was compared against the stomach and gave us several rounds of clipping and trimming until it could fit. Following this, the torso was assembled and the gut plate was glued to the stomach. The legs were then glued to the torso. I found this a little fiddly as normally they attach to the giant fly, but it is doable. Once the legs were in place, I was able to compare the torso against the Carnosaur saddle. The space available was far too narrow to support the heft of a putrid Blight King, which meant that my clippers were broken out once again and the saddle was cut down and glued together. After a second comparison, I found things were looking better, but they weren't perfect, so more trims and adjustments were made to both the rider and the saddle until I was finally able to glue the two parts together. Tamacon's choice of weapon is a huge two-handed axe, and I recreated this with a Puscoil scythe arm and the Blight King axe. Both the scythe and axe heads were then removed from their respective shafts. To offer a little extra strength in the bond, I drilled a 1mm hole into both the axe blade and the scythe's handle. Some 1mm steel wire was superglued into one hole, and the other half was placed on top of that, completing the axe and giving it a much sturdier bond. The axe arm was then glued to the torso, followed by the Plaguebearer styled head from the Blightlord kit, and then the left arm. To bulk out the saddle a little, I took a shield from the Putrid Blight King's kit, flipped it upside down, and glued it to the back of the saddle, creating a sort of seat. All that was left to do now was to mix up one final batch of green stuff, fill in a few of the remaining gaps, and also add a little extra padding to the saddle. With this done, I could turn my attention to the base. I opted to mount the Toad Dragon on a 100mm base. This would allow me to field it as a proxy for Orgot's Demon Spew. It's a similar size and the weapons and rules generally make sense. But rather than just gluing the model to the base, I instead decided to have the Toad Dragon climbing across rocks. This would build upon that appearance of weight and give the model more of a lumbering appearance. The rocks were formed from my ever favourite cork floor tiles. These were torn up and stacked up beneath the Toad Dragon's forearm until it was roughly the same height. While the layers were glued together, they weren't glued to the base until the stack was completed. From here, the contact points of the dragon and the rock were marked out, and the rocks were then glued to the base. With my base layout established, further rocks could be built up around the base, including a second stack of rocks to hold up the rear right foot as well. Then, to break up the defined layers, some heavy modelling paste was added to the rocks and smoothed out with a wet brush. Once dry, I could sand everything down to create some smoother points of stone to contrast against the more jagged looking parts. Then, to finish off, a few Citadel skulls were superglued across the base. But I didn't glue the Toad Dragon to it just yet. Instead, I mounted it to a smaller, temporary base and created a pin holder for the rider. This wasn't completely necessary, but keeping the 3 parts separate would make them easier to paint. Came to painting the Toad Dragon. I started out with some Rattle Count primers from the Colour Forge. For the Toad Dragon itself, I sprayed the underside of the model first using some desert sand, before spraying it from above with some Death Rattle Green. This created a transition from the green of the scales to the tan coloration of the softer, flabbier underbelly. The rider, on the other hand, was primed with Trench Brown. The light brown of this colour gave me an excellent starting point for the lighter flesh tone that I intended to apply. With the primers and base colours in place, my first painting tasks were to give the flesh of the Toad Dragon a little more definition in its details. This would begin with some washes. Washes, when applied across the surface, tend to flow into the dips and recesses. Once they dry, they create a darker area, which helps to imitate shadows whilst also adding definition to the surrounding details. For the first wash, I used some Necrosis Green from the Tooth and Coats range of paints and applied this across all of the green areas of the model. This was then followed by a similar wash of Archaic Sepia, which was instead applied over the areas primed with desert sand. While the wash had darkened down the recesses, lighting the raised details would help to further their definition, and a really quick and easy way of achieving this is with dry brushing. To do this, a little Troll Snot Green was applied to my texture palette. From here, a slightly dampened Artus Opus dry brush was dipped into the paint and worked through the bristles by using a circular motion across the palette. Once the paint had evenly coated the bristles, a combination of light strokes and stippling was used to build up a thin layer of the paint across the hard edges and raised details of the scales. This effect was then furthered with a slightly lighter green created from a mixture of Troll Snot Green and Ivory Tusk. I applied this in the same way as before, but was a little lighter with my application, so that only the most prominent points were touched by the paint. Using the same mixture of paint, I then used a regular brush to perform a highlight to a few of the sharper details. This saw me paint on fine lines and dots, which, combined with the previous washes, resulted in a much more detailed looking surface. But I wasn't quite happy with how dark the recesses were looking around the scales, so I applied a targeted wash of Hellion Red directly into the deep recesses between the scales. The red coloration contrasted nicely against the green, whilst also giving the surface a more fleshy tone. Once complete, I was left with some much more well-defined scales. This same process was then repeated across the desert sand areas, albeit with different coloured paints. I began with a Cerberus Brown dry brush, followed by a lighter Cerberus Brown and Ivory Tusk mix, which was applied both as a dry brush and as an edge highlight. Finally, the recesses were hit with a direct wash of Magi Purple, completing the skin. To paint the inside of the Toad Dragon's mouth, I settled on the rich tones of Sword Hilt Burgundy. After slightly diluting the paint to allow it to cover more evenly, I carefully painted the mouth, paying close attention around the green and tan skin areas. After my first layer, a second was applied over the top to give it a stronger starting colour. The recesses were then darkened down with another wash of Magi Purple, before I returned to Sword Hilt Burgundy to recoat the surfaces that I'd previously base coated. However, this time around, I avoided the recesses to retain the Magi Purple shading. From here, the edges were picked out with some fine lines of Glistening Gums, before I picked out a few select points with some hot pink. With the mouth complete, I turned my attention to the rider. His skin was base coated first with Kronos Flesh, followed by a targeted wash of Hellion Red to give the skin a raw and chafed appearance. It was then given an initial highlight of some Ares Flesh, with my final highlight being a few spots of Ivory Tusk. Next, I painted the leather straps across both the rider and the dragon with some Scorched Earth, darkened down their recesses with some Oblivion Black Wash. followed by my first highlight of Ancient Forest, and then some Wasteland Brown. For the armour, weapons and other metallic details, I wanted to create the appearance of a dark, rusted iron. To do this, I started out with a base coat of Dwarven Iron, before darkening it down further with some Oblivion Black Wash. Then, to create the rust effect, I watered down a little dry rust brown and applied these in random patches across the metallics. By watering down the paint, it allowed it to pool into the recesses more easily. Once dry, I was left with some rusty looking patches. These were furthered with a few small spots of Satyr Brown inside them, before the edges were picked out with some rough edge highlights of plate armour. These brighter spots of silver created the impression of the armour being scratched and damaged, creating some cleaner looking points. For the wooden handle of the axe and the saddle, I began with some Ashen Grey, washed it with Oblivion Black, and then finished it off with an initial highlight of Eidolon Grey, followed by some Rodent Grey. To paint the cloth around the rider's upper legs, I started with a base coat of Death Reaper, and then highlighted it with the greyish blue tones of Cold Corpse Blue, and finally, Wolf Grey. All the horns, claws and teeth across both the rider and the mount were then base coated with Wizard Grey, washed with Battle Mud. These areas were then highlighted with some of the lighter Carcharadon Grey, with just a few small points of Trooper White to pick out the sharpest points. In addition to this highlight, I also used this paint to base coat the eyes, which were then given a coat of yellow glaze, leaving me with some bright yellow eyeballs. These were then finished off with some small spots of Doom Death Black to create the pupils. And with that, the rider and the mount were both complete, and I could return to the base. For the base, I wanted something swampy to reflect the rider's Nurgle aesthetic, and so decided to prime everything with some more Colourforge primer. This time, I settled on the dark brown of Hyrax Brown. To paint the rocks, I broke out my dry brush once again and coated them with some Dungeon Stone Grey, followed by a slightly lighter application of Wizard Grey. To give the rocks a mossy appearance, they were then washed with some Orc Flesh. I targeted this wash primarily into the recesses, but a slightly more watered down mix was also used across the surfaces of the rocks. Finally, to bring out the sharpness of the rocks, I gave them a final dry brush of Carcharadon Grey. Next up were the skulls I'd added earlier. These were base coated with Dust Bowl, and then highlighted with Sandstone, followed by another highlight using a little less Temple Stone. At this point, I was finally ready to start assembling the three parts, but my first task was to carefully remove the Toad Dragon from its temporary base. Once it had been popped off, the surface was scraped clean, along with the point on the base where I'd attach it to the contact points of the rider. With all the contact points clean of paint, the three pieces were glued together. But the base wasn't done yet. To create that swampy effect around the base, I decided to apply some of AK Interactive's wet ground texture paste. This was carefully applied around the rocks and the Toad Dragon's foot until I covered the whole base, where I was allowed to fully dry. I then continued working on the base by adding some foliage. I began this process by first supergluing a few tufts of AK moss across the rocks, followed by some larger tufts of gamer grass in various shapes, colours and sizes. These were mainly focused around the edges of the base, but I also placed a few across the rocks. To really push that swampy aspect, I then poured some of AK puddles around the rocks to create some muddy spots of water. After adding a few spots, they were then spread around with a brush. Finally, I sprinkled a few pieces of green basing flock onto some of the still wet puddles. A little more puddles was poured over the top, and the result was that of foliage floating in the water. And with that, I was left with this. And here we have the finished Toad Dragon. While my interpretation is considerably smaller than the original Tamacon miniature, I think that this build is much more usable on the tabletop. as well as being considerably cheaper to build too. There are a few design differences, such as the spines, which I kept from the Morlock kit, and the less splayed positions of the legs, but I think overall there are enough details from the original to make this miniature recognisable as a Toad Dragon. So, if after playing the new Thrones of Decay DLC for Total War Warhammer 3, you fancy building one of these for yourself, then you can find all the kits and tools used to make this model in the description below. If you have any suggestions for other Old World or Total War builds you'd like to see me tackle, then please do leave me those in the comments below. But before I go, I just want to thank my Patreon supporters and channel members, the people who are responsible for keeping these videos coming, especially my Pouch of Dead Animal Bits tier and above supporters who are Andrew Consol, Axel Jonsson, Bartosz Sikowski, Berserker, Bits of Wargaming, Daniel Dowling, Gabe Benavides, Hugh Wright, Ian, Ilniro Gulari, Immaterial Creations, Maciej Savitsky, Matt Brower, Molly Mork, Morgan, Mr. Grimm, Nima, Pale Juice, Ryan Little, Splinkus, Swedsman, Tim, and Tom Hay-Smith. And my Sergeant level channel members who are Lloyd Davies, Trooper Geo, Mr. Jared Hess 95, David, John Gibbs, The Sire Acquired, Philip Poya, Nerdington Paints, Mog Taylor, and Whale Tussler. So until next time, thanks for watching, and goodbye.